Okay, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to welcome McKeever. A little bit about his past. He used to teach in graduate painting at the Slade from 87 till 97. But I actually saw a lecture that he gave. He was invited by Malcolm Hughes in the 70s. I actually saw a lecture that was a very, very interesting lecture. I've never forgotten. There's some lectures you just remember, and it was he had paintings in trenches and things like that. Anyway, before the Slade, he taught at Camberwell in the 80s, and then after the Slade, he was Professor of Drawing at the Royal Academy from 2006 to 2011. He is a Royal Academician, needless to say. In 1990, he had a retrospective at the Whitechapel, and at the moment he's got a show on in Copenhagen called Portrait of a Woman until 6th of November. He's also got a show coming up at Stockholm, and then on the 28th of January next year he's got a show opening at Matt's Gallery. Matt's Gallery's new space in Bermondsey. Anyway, it's fantastic to have Ian here again.
Thank you. Hi, I'll leave the lights up for a couple of minutes. It's the mid-1970s. I'm in my late 20s. I came to art late, so I'm young and uninformed. I've managed to inveigle my way into the offices of Studio International, which is the leading art magazine at the time in London. The occasion is that Clement Greenberg, the great authority, but sort of god of abstract expressionism, is giving a talk. And I, in my naivety, have managed to get into the room and to be there in his presence. He is talking about abstract expressionism and primitivism. Greenberg is an imposing character. He's been around in the art scene for a long, long time, and has in a sense been the voice of American painting. Midway into the lecture, in a very portentous voice, he says, well, Mark Rothko painted 3 good paintings. Barnett Newman, he painted 2. And Wilhelm de Kooning only painted 1. I'm totally flummoxed. I leave the lecture and I rush back to my studio to thumb through what few books I have or catalogues I have on abstract expressionism. I look endlessly for the 3 paintings, the 2 paintings, and the 1 painting. Of course, needless to say, I never find them. And anyway, Greenberg was making another kind of point. Maybe the point he was making was, in fact, he was saying there are 3 seminal points within their work that actually can be defined by 3 paintings at a given time. I've been working for 45 years, but rather than actually indulge you in trying to figure out which are the seminal pieces, I thought I would actually just concentrate on the last 20 years or so. My work initially, when I started working, let me just explain. My formative years cut across the latter days of abstract expressionism and the emergence of conceptualism. The one was all about gesture, the other was all about the head. I painted paintings and made works which were gestural, but equally the conceptually intrigued me. I worked with photographs, I worked with painting, I worked with drawings. At the time I was too wet and messy for conceptualists, and I was too intellectually dry for the painters. But that's a by the by. But over the years my work emerged more in what I suppose we call the mainstream of painting. So it's about painting I'd like to try and talk to you. And I'd like to try and talk about some very simple things, such things as time, space, the body, and actually just the notion of what a physical painting is, how we actually relate to it. So, I'm going to be a little bit like the weatherman, in that I'll be talking about one thing and the images may be doing something else, but I presume you've all seen the 10 o'clock news post weather often enough to be able to deal with two disparate bits of language going on. So perhaps we can turn down the lights. I don't quite know how we do them. Is it here? Okay. Although maybe I don't need to. Can you actually see the images with the lights as it is? Maybe we don't need to turn the lights. I never know. You can see them, can't you? It's absolutely fine. Yeah, okay. The last 25 years or so, I've lived in rural Dorset. I moved there from London. The question that people always asked me when they came down, or actually the question that was sort of predicated on a known answer, at least for them, was what's been the influence of living in rural Dorset on your work? And of course the answer was always space. That somehow being out of the confines of the city and all of that sort of concrete around you, with buildings on either side, something to be in an open landscape with expansive views, big skies, that in fact would be the major thing. But actually the more I thought about it, I disagreed. The thing that really got to me was actually time. Of course, everyone has this particular notion that, or this quaint notion that there is one time in the city and that folk in the countryside actually live at a slower pace. And of course, there's a truth in that. But there is another kind of time that actually relates to the painter, which is actually the time it takes to paint a painting. Painting has time engendered in it. It actually lives in the painting. It's actually one of the things that people come to when they look at a painting. Not only are they experiencing image and content, they're also experiencing a notion of time. It's somehow implicit in the painting. And in that sense, it can be like a tool, like every other kind of tool that one uses in painting. One can actually work with time. So for instance, I work in groups. It takes me a long time to finish a painting. It can take me 2 years to finish a painting. That doesn't mean I'm working on it every day. Often I'm rotating several paintings, leaving one for several months and coming back to it much later. So by the end of a group of paintings, I've got 15, 20 paintings finished, or perhaps even 10, some of which have taken 3 years, some of which have taken 9 months. I never know which one I started with and which was the last one. They're all somehow suspended in a kind of time, in a notion of time. If a painting's going well, I stop working on it. It's going too fast, it's too heated, it's got too much pace in it. So I put it away and I start on another one. This quality, how can I put it? Well, Joseph Brodsky, the American poet and writer, he talked about time unlike water being horizontal. And that notion intrigues me. Most things that flow are not actually horizontal, they're slightly on an angle. If they're completely on the horizontal, they don't go anywhere, they just sit where they are. And yet the notion that actually time itself can flow horizontally intrigues me. That relationship between time and space. If one is going one way, perhaps the other one is going the other way. This can perhaps be further qualified by something that the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard said. He talked about remembrance and repetition. That actually we remember backwards and we repeat forwards. And this in a way could be said to be a very beautiful summation of what a painting is. That one remembers backwards into the painting as one's working, and one repeats forward the actual act of making the painting, the actual gestural work of actually making a painting. And so a painting becomes a sort of convergence of these two different things. There is somehow implicit in this a kind of, I'm struggling for words here, let me think. Well, there is if we are remembering backwards, and we are repeating forwards, the act of just making gestures in a painting, then anyway we are, no, I don't know how to put it, so I'm going to have to give up on that thought. You'll find, I'm sorry, I'm a little bit rusty, I haven't spoken about the work for a long, long time, so it may take me a bit of time to think my way through some of these things. An American friend is traveling in America, he's hitchhiking, he's a painter, and someone picks him up and he says to him, what do you do? He says, well, I'm a painter. And so the person says, well, that's interesting, what's your subject matter? Is it indoor, outdoor, or wildlife? Now these seem to me actually very good categories, because actually most painting, if you think about it, does actually fit into those categories. But if we think about the nature of subject matter, then life gets very, very complicated. It seems so simple, yet actually it's so complicated. The British tradition is very pictorial. We love a narrative. We like to tell a story. We like work which actually has some kind of narrative base to it, whereby actually the intellectual side of the abstract painting is displaced through a storyline. I tend to stand in opposition to that. The kind of painting that interests me is actually the kind of painting that is totally abstract in a sense, that actually begins somewhere else, that actually begins abstract. Our notion of historical space, historical picture making, if you think it goes from the given world, a table or a chair, and then one abstracts it, it becomes more and more abstract. And we call that abstract. That in fact we have reduced what we see to something simple, a series of lines, a series of shapes, a series of colors. But what interests me is actually coming at it another way, is to actually begin thinking abstract with a view to actually moving to the figurative. So that if you like, I'm starting on the other side, I'm trying to actually take abstract concepts, abstract thoughts, feelings, ideas, sensations, and actually bring them into something concrete in the world. To actually give them a notion of being figured in the world. Now, of course, this is a tricky area. It's very, very fragile. It can be something, it can be nothing. It can have something of meaning in it, it can be of no substance whatsoever. Leonardo da Vinci said, of course, that painting begins with the mind. And for me, this is where it is actually coming from. That actually it begins with the self as a centered being and actually evolves from there. So it becomes, in a sense, how to figure that, how to figure abstract thought, abstract sensations, abstract feelings, and actually bring them into being as something concrete in the world. Perhaps here I could just read you a quote from something that I wrote quite some years ago. When he woke in the morning, he was surprised to find he was the same person he had been the night before, with the same arms and legs, able to recognize himself in the mirror, and actually able to remember, able to continue a line of thought he had days, weeks, even months before. When he woke up, he half expected to find himself like Caspar's Gregor, transformed into a giant beetle, or that the floor on which he so securely stood the previous night might have shifted into a liquid mass in which he could lose himself. He had thin skin. In fact, it felt porous. He was not exactly sure where his own body ended and the rest of the world began. Equally, he was not sure where others finished, and he might begin. He could neither understand the limitations of his own skin, nor the palpable intrusions of the world around him. He painted to see what he could only sense. And in a sense, I think in essence, that's what I try to paint. I try to paint a kind of sense of being in the world, in whatever way that manifests itself. So notions of concrete subject matter to do with tables and chairs have absolutely no interest in me whatsoever, for me whatsoever. It's to do with my actually trying to concretize something which is to do with just being actually present in the world, with actually being a sensate being in the world. Of course, one finds this when one gets hold of it actually in the painting, in the corporality of the painting, the physicality of the painting. In that sense, paintings are interesting things. They're, if you think of paint, that liquid fluid stuff that you put on a surface, when it gets on the surface, in fact, it's never out of focus. Paint itself, the physical stuff of paint, is never out of focus. But what does go out of focus, even with the most resolute image-based work, is actually what that image is, what that image is actually about. That begins to blur. And so I guess my anchor in working is actually the affirmation of the painting itself, the capacity of the physical painting, the physical object, to actually hold itself for me. Paintings either breathe in or they breathe out. They are either coming out towards you or they are moving away from you. They are either introverted or they're extroverted. They either want to embrace you or they want to push you away. Of course, all of these qualities reflect not only the nature of painting, but actually the nature of the artist, him or herself. Actually, the temperament of the artist, what it is they're actually trying to do. Some artists want to pull you into the work, want to actually engage you in the work, actually want to be generous with you. Other artists actually want to hide. They want to secrete themselves in the work so that actually you can't get close to them. These qualities underpin much of what painting is about. And yet they're things that actually very rarely get talked about. But anyway, I try to paint paintings which are opening out, which are actually spraying out into the world. A.K. Chesterton, the writer, in a small book called Orthodoxy, said he was glad that the painter was glad that the canvas was flat. It's such a stupid, dumb statement, but actually there's so much truth in it. Because if you are a painter, the last thing you want is a moving surface. What you actually want is a stable surface to work upon. And in that sense, painting is a curious thing. Here we are, three-dimensional human beings, living in a three-dimensional world, and yet somehow beguiled by a two-dimensional object, a flat surface. What is it that actually pulls us to that? What actually is it that draws us in? We are, as human beings, incredibly frontal. Our nose, eyes, mouth, sexual organs, hands, feet, everything face forwards. In that sense, we're actually a very restricted, physically, a very restricted three-dimensional person. For instance, we don't have arms that can go through 360 degrees. We can't turn our head 180 degrees. We let our head do it all for us. But actually, you would think by now we would have evolved that far. that in fact we'd be able to turn our head all the way around, we'd be able to turn our feet around and walk the other way if we want to, and actually have our arms and legs just go off wherever they want to do. Why not? Why haven't we evolved like that? Perhaps it's because we have mental overload, it would be too much. And perhaps that's also one of the reasons why we go back to two-dimensional images, be they photographs, paintings, or anything else. We go back to find a kind of affirmation of our own two-dimensionality, to actually get a kind of respite from the complexity of the three-dimensional world. And that relationship between my three-dimensionality, my frontality, and the frontality of the painting, the two-dimensionality of the painting, yet the implicit body of the painting, is something that intrigues me enormously. How do I relate to the painting as a body-to-body, one-to-one? Perhaps related to this, and to the whole body thing, is how we actually understand the body. For instance, I think it has a lot to do with architecture. Our own architecture, the architecture of the painting, architecture as a building, how all of these things actually ebb and flow into each other. Many years ago, I took a group of students to Switzerland, and we went to Jungfrau, up one of the mountains up in the Swiss Alps. And there's an area where you can actually go inside the glacier. You can actually sort of go in a tunnel and go along through the glacier. And actually it was the most bizarre sensation to be living in the body, or to be walking, moving in the body of a glacier. To feel that in fact, here was all this moving ice, imperceptibly moving, but nevertheless moving. And that one was actually inside it. It's curious in that we occupy this space whereby we are inside things, but at the same time inside ourselves. We're sort of double-skinned all the time. Skinned by buildings, skinned by clothes, the skin itself. But all of these boundaries and the limits of these boundaries and the kind of architecture of these boundaries, be it a building, be it actually just the relationship of two people standing next to each other. Why do two people standing next to each other give each other a kind of proximity? Why do we all just walk around hugging each other? You know, all of these somehow have kind of implicit in them kinds of architecture, structures, which actually intrigue me, and which actually somehow might be possible to find some kind of manifestation in a kind of painting, or a parallel to it in a kind of painting. When I mentioned about Joseph Brodsky and horizontal time, the immediate question that comes up is that if time is horizontal, then is space vertical? After all, we look down to look close to us, we look up to look far away. Our movement in actually perceiving space is not actually this way, but is actually vertical. And that intrigues me in terms of how one actually understands a painting. Whether or not a painting is vertical, or whether or not a painting is horizontal. Does the compacting and the sort of narrowing down of a vertical painting suggest another kind of space to that of a wide open painting? Does the narrow space suggest a single body? Does a wide open space for a painting, a horizontal painting, suggest a multiplicity of bodies? These kind of relationships are quite simple things, intrigue me enormously. In painting, there are basically three kinds of space. There is perspectival space, there is on the surface space, and there is the space in front of the painting. If you go to something like the Abstract Expressionist exhibition at the Royal Academy at the moment, you can probably see these states of space quite clearly. If you think of Jackson Pollock, then he in fact invites you into the space. He even spoke about when I'm in my paintings. In a sense, he is a sort of latter-day perspectival painter. If you look at the work of Barney Newman, then in fact the paint sits on the surface. It's flat space. And if you look at Mark Rothko, then his forms seem to actually be hovering in front of the space. It is actually as if they're in front of the canvas. And it is this space that really intrigues me. The space actually between myself and the canvas. The gap between myself and the canvas. This perhaps relates in one way to something like Russian icon painting space, which is a kind of reverse perspective, whereby instead of you zooming into a focal point to a vanishing point in the distance, your vanishing point is actually with the viewer, and from that point onwards it's actually opening out. And it's actually that kind of space that intrigues me. In a way, how do I open up? How do I make physical on the painting the space that exists between myself and the painting? Perhaps related to this is, if I quote something else, might help to say something about this. He sat, looked. His gaze moved slowly across the floor to the wall beyond. He slouched back into the chair, eyes focused on the painting directly across the room. As he did, he began to pulse in and out of focus. His gaze wandered away from the painting and eased itself back down to the paint-splattered floor. From the gap where the floor met the wall, a gentle and at first almost imperceptible ripple began to emerge. Growing in size and momentum, it waved its way towards him, bellying up into a huge gut. Approaching him now shoulder high and moving fast, it pushed him hard back into the chair, passed through him, then beyond. In that instant, he felt both fear and elation. That same sensation when as a child he stood on the beach and looked out to sea, as if it were heaving up to meet him, higher, taller than himself, engulfing. Then the floor was flat again, and as his head tilted upwards and his eyes retraced their way up the wall, the painting came out once more to meet his gaze. He sat, he waited, then slowly got up, unthinkingly walked back to the open door and looked out. If you go to the National Gallery and start in the Sanctuary wing with the late Byzantine Duo and Trecento painting, and then slowly make your way through the galleries chronologically, what becomes very clear is that slowly but surely the light goes out of the painting, until by the time you get to the 16th century, it's Caravaggio and candlelight. Slowly but surely, all of that Byzantine light, all of that early light is left. And painting has become a world of shadows. You then continue, and it's not until the 19th century that light comes back into painting, at which point we're with the Impressionists and the Post-Impressionists. However, what's happened is that what we might call the divine light of early painting has been replaced by the prosaic light of the perceived world. course, all painters work with light, but indeed some have worked with it far more than others do. For instance, if you think of someone like Vermeer, then he clearly presents to the painting a kind of omnipresent light, not too dissimilar from the icon, in which everything is illuminated, there are no shadows. Whilst if you take a painter like Willem Hanshoy, the 19th century Danish painter, then his world is a world of fading light. It's a time of losing light. One could say it's almost analogous to that sensation of sitting in the studio when the light's going, when the natural light's going. And suddenly the image one is looking at in the painting, or the painting one is looking at, suddenly starts to just become a ghost of itself. Robert Grosseteste, the 13th century Bishop of Lincoln, in a book called The Luna, believed that light was material, that actually it was the material of light, of life. Louis Kahn, the American architect, talked about light, stating, "We are born out of light. I believe light is the maker of all material. Material is spent light." And William Burroughs, the experimental American writer in the 60s, wrote about how every time someone takes a photograph, they're actually stealing a piece of light. And actually, slowly but surely, there will be no light left in the world. And we will all be sitting in a cave somewhere, looking at photographs by candlelight. That being our only source of light, and the photographs being our only source of images left in the world. Given that Burroughs wrote that in the 1950s, it's not so far away from what's actually really happening now. That people spend so much time taking photographs of one kind or another. Before it goes around a museum, most young people are not actually looking at the work, they're actually looking at the image that they took of the work on their iPhones. So Burroughs' comment was actually very perceptive. So light intrigues me enormously. How do you actually imbue the painting with light? Not depicting light in the sense of chiaroscuro, but actually give it a kind of internal light, so that it actually looks like the light is actually emanating from the work. So it actually has a corporality to it, a sort of physicality to it, that is somehow emanating rather than actually being depicted. Of course, related to this is colour. Although this is a colour painting, I work with a very limited palette. For many years I worked primarily just with black and white. I don't know the reason for that. Perhaps it's because in my early work I worked with large black and white photographs, and it's a legacy from that. But I find colour difficult. I find a lot of colour in a painting hard to take. So I work with a very limited palette, usually only 2 or 3 colours, or in this instance, just 2, white and blue. The background colour actually being the colour of the raw linen. If one looks at black and white, they're interesting. If you pick up a 1 litre can of black paint, it's very light. But put it on the canvas and it gets heavy. You pick up a can of 1 litre white and it's very heavy. But you put it on the canvas and it gets light. The two function so differently. Black gets fat and heavy and thick. White stays light and is somehow elusive. It's evasive. It's trying to escape you all the time. Work with black and the painting will close down fast. It'll get heavy fast. It becomes opaque fast. Leave it transparent and it isn't really black. White, on the other hand, can be extended much more fully. It can be opened out much more. It seems to have much more variables in it. And so just those two things the black and the white, and the different properties that they have, actually seem to allow me an enormous scope within what is the nature of colour, with what is the nature of paint. My interest in working with colour is, in a sense, to try to wed the colour to the painting. Not to use it as a process of depiction or means of depiction, but actually to try and make it somehow implicitly of the painting, so that the painting becomes inseparable from the colour, rather than being about description or about being pictorial. There is a very interesting book, a small book by Ludwig Wittgenstein. Its German name is Bemerkungen über die Farben, which in English is Remarks on Colour. It's a wonderful little book. It's a series of aphorisms on the nature of colour. The psychological, the emotional, the perceptual nature of looking at colour. Just very short little statements. And at one point in the book, Wittgenstein makes the distinction between colours on surface and the colour's body. Paint is colour on surface. It's just surface coloured. Whilst if you look at the orange in a carrot, it goes all the way through the carrot. It's actually colour as body. What's curious about the painter, certainly for me, is that one is working with the one, two-dimensional flat colour, but actually one is trying to make the other a body of colour. One is actually trying to make the painting hold a body equivalent to the substance of the carrot. Of course, it's a fool's errand, but nevertheless, one is trying to do it. To some extent, giving a painting colour, giving a painting body, necessitates that it retains some degree of transparency. Close it off completely and it will just be flat. Whilst as long as you actually keep it open, keep it transparent, it has the capacity to actually hold depth. Caspar David Friedrich, in talking about this, said that actually one used transparency to annul the materiality of colour, to actually prevent colour from actually becoming totally material. And Novalis, the German poet, spoke about every transparent body is in a high state. It seems to have a kind of consciousness. And that area of actually trying to give the colour itself some kind of presence in the world, retaining a transparency, seems to be very important. What's interesting about the British tradition in painting is how different that on the whole has tended to be. If you go to if you go back to the National Gallery, it's actually room 34 before you come to British painting. In the meantime, you've passed through everyone. You've passed through Piero della Francesco, Leonardo, Titian, Raphael, you name them, you passed through them all. They've all been there years before. So the British tradition of painting is actually a very, very late tradition. And what's curious about it, if you do go to room 34, which is Turner, Constable and Stubbs, is how brown it is. It's a very brown tradition. It's as if the brown of the work reflects the mud of our country, that actually we're a country built on mud. We're not built on rock and light, we're actually built on water and mud. And somehow the kind of painting seems to reflect that. Edvard Munch, the Norwegian painter, thought the British used brown in order to obfuscate. Mark Rothko thought the British used brown in order to actually blur the boundaries because they didn't actually know what they really wanted to say with it, with the paint. So in a sense, going back to our own history in painting, is problematic. And in fact, our own British tradition of painting is very, very thin. If you go to the Turbine Hall in the Tate, to one of the very large installations, one is blown away by the size, by the spectacle of it. You then go into the galleries, and suddenly you're presented with a small, modest painting. How is that painting supposed to compete? How is painting supposed to find its place in the world today against such an onslaught of size? Most work these days, or much work these days, is flexi-sized. If you do a video installation, you can make the screen 2 meters wide, 5 meters wide, 10 meters wide. If you do certain other kind of works, again, the size can be modified to fit the space on hand. The poor old painting, it's stuck. It's just a particular size. It's 5 feet by 7 feet, it's 2 feet by 3 feet, and irrespective of what's going on around it, it's not going to get any bigger. So how does the painting deal with that? I don't have an answer, but I think certainly today, it's a very real question. I tend to know my own limitations. The biggest painting I've ever painted is 7 meters wide and just under 3 meters high. I found it hard. I found it hard to hold it body to body. I wondered at times if I was not holding it body to body, but instead actually just making a composition. Actually standing away from it and actually seeing it as constructing a composition. I know that if I work smaller, I'm more comfortable. If I work, say, 2 meters by 3 meters, I'm comfortable with it. I can range over it. My body can find its place in relationship to it. And I can actually hold it as an entity. I think these things in painting are important. How we actually understand the kind of sizes we work with. And actually how aware we are of it. Michel Foucault, the French philosopher, wrote a book in the 70s, which was actually very important to me. It's called The Archaeology of Knowledge. And certainly in my reading at the time, it was a very important source. In the book, Foucault raises the question of the relationship between monuments and documents, and proposes that actually an object or a thing can move from being a document to being a monument. And then equally, it can go the other way around. It can start out as a monument and actually become a document. So you can say that, say, all of the statues around London that Queen Victoria put up of Albert, which started out as monuments, have slowly but surely become historical documents. Equally, you can say that a letter that someone wrote, I don't know, say we found a letter by Shakespeare or something, that it would go from actually being a document to becoming monumental. And this sort of flip between these two things interests me enormously. Is it possible for the modesty of a painting in the context of these very large art pieces that are made now to actually find some way of finding its own monumentality, whereby, although its size is still relative, it nevertheless has the capacity to actually carry a monumental feel? course, this relates back to the body very much, and perhaps to the mind. I remember going to the Historical Painting Museum in Munich and looking for a painting I particularly wanted to see by Albert Altdorfer, who was one of the early German painters, of St. George and the Dragon. I'd only ever seen this painting in reproduction. And sure enough, I got to the Alte Pinakothek in Munich, and there it was on the wall. I thought it was a big painting. It's actually 20 inches by 15 inches, something like that. So here was this tiny painting, and yet it had huge monumental presence. And that question of how you actually imbue a painting with that kind of monumentality is very intriguing. Just as the question of when a painting is that small, whereby, if you like, you can't get your body into it, what does go into it? Is it a mind-to-mind experience? Is it a head-to-head experience? These questions intrigue me. To quote a well-known song, it's gravity that pulls us down and destiny that pulls us apart. That's Bob Dylan, our new Nobel laureate for literature. It's an interesting observation. He came up with some really great lines sometimes. Paintings seem to hold both those things. Paintings have two kinds of gravities in them. They have the physical gravity of actually being rooted as a painting. And for me, it's important that actually a painting feels that it has a top and a bottom, that it feels that it's actually rooted inside the canvas, that it's actually rooted top to bottom. But actually, one is also looking for something else. One's looking for a kind of an affirmation of elevation beyond that. So in a painting, one is looking for, or at least I'm looking for, a kind of rootedness and a kind of elevation. You can be grand and call it an elevation of the spirit, an elevation of the soul, whatever you want to call it. But nevertheless, an attempt to actually let the painting lift off. So on the one hand, you're trying to anchor it down, you're trying to hold it to reality. And on another level, you're trying to set it free. You're trying to let it go in the world. And that tension between the two, I find very intriguing. Another line from a song. I never walk around mirrors. Hate to see a grown man cry. When was the last time you cried in front of a painting? When was the last time you actually felt so touched by a painting that it almost reduced you to tears? We now live in a kind of postmodern world where, in fact, much talk like this is somehow embarrassing and sort of gone out of the window. Postmodernism sort of inculcated a kind of, an almost kind of cynical notion that one is actually constantly distant from things, one is commenting on things, but actually one's emotions are not getting too involved. This, I think, for painting, introduces a real dilemma. The only paintings that I'm ever interested in are the ones that really move me. I'm not interested in trickery, I'm not interested in fancy stuff, I'm not interested in novelty. I want to stand in front of a painting and I actually want to be moved by it. Yet it's a question now if painting can really do that. I'll just say a couple of things specifically about these. These are the smallest things I've ever made. They're all 45 by 33. I find working small very, very difficult. I find it impossible to stop the work looking like fragments. And these are all actually abandoned bits of paintings. I abandon a lot of paintings. If they're not going well, I throw them away. And these are fragments of abandoned canvases that I've then stuck onto plywood and reworked. And they were actually made for a church in Cologne. I was invited some years ago to, 14, just a couple of years ago, to show some work there. And most of the works that went into the space were actually large installations. And so, of course, my immediate thought was, well, how do you compete with a space that's as big as this? With big walls, grand windows, arched ceilings, etc. And so I thought, in the end, well, actually, the best thing to do is not to compete with it, is to actually go exactly the opposite way. And so I made about 30 very small paintings that were just scattered around the walls of the church. So that actually had to go to the works rather than take on the space with the work. You actually had to go to the works in order to get to it. I've been speaking very generally and probably very abstractly without probably really saying much about my own practice. These are my last photo panel pieces. I still work with photographs, but I see them as running parallel with the paintings rather than... Each of these works is again, a small wooden panel overpainted, and the other half is a black and white photograph. So I thought what I'd try to do, to try and pull it all back a bit, is talk about a recent group of works more specifically that might maybe anchor you into something specific about the work. In 1994-95, I made 3 large paintings called Marina North. Marina North was a 19th century traveller painter, a sort of explorer, of which there were several in the UK at the time. There was something often wealthy, independent women of the period did. Very gutsy, she went all over the world. Here she is photographed by Margaret Julie Cameron when she was in Sri Lanka. Of course, the photograph is very posed, all of the garb and everything is supposed to make her somehow some sort of maiden of the tropics or what have you, So, but Mary North, wherever she went, she made small paintings, botanical studies, which actually are not so different from, she could say to be the precursor of George O'Keeffe in a way. The show was just about to finish at the Tate. And all of these paintings are housed in a pavilion that was specifically built, a small pavilion that was specifically built for her work in Kew Gardens. What's interesting about Mary North is that she was not accepted amongst the botanical fraternity because, in a sense, she wasn't a scientist. And equally, being a woman with no formal art training, she actually wasn't accepted as an artist. You won't find her work in the National Gallery or anywhere else. You'll only find it at Kew Gardens, all of these little paintings. But I've always found her work curious. I've always thought there was something to it. And I particularly like the fact that the pavilion where all the work is, the pictures go all the way around, floor to ceiling. It's like a sort of Gesamtkunstwerk, work, a sort of total work of painting. I've always really liked it. So I painted those 3 big paintings called the Mariner North paintings. Things often sit in me for years. I have a thought and I think I should do something about it, and it sits there for a very, very long time. And about 3 years ago I started on another group of paintings about women. They're all called Portrait of a Woman. They're all made up of 3 panels, 2 side panels which tend to be more monochromatic and denser, and a central, more transparent, open panel. The genesis for working on them comes from early Italian and European painting. If one looks at the history of portrait painting, then up until about the 15th century, all the portraits are actually in profile. It's only in the 15th century that it actually begins to become full face. And this relationship between profile and full face is something that intrigues me. For instance, can we also talk about a painting either facing you full face or somehow looking at you in profile? Can we speak about a painting which gazes back to you, and a kind of painting which somehow eludes your gaze, which actually doesn't allow you into it, which refuses to face full on to you? I was very intrigued in these paintings by the relationship between the face, the head, and the kind of formal constructs that are going on around it. So, for instance, in the Filippo Lippi, the head is structured around with architecture, is structured with the formalism of the clothing. And this, in a sense, allows the head to find a place to locate itself. So the kind of amorphous nature of the face, the physiognomy of the face, which one might call fleshy and open, somehow becomes controlled and constrained within the formalism, by the formal aspects of architecture and clothing. If you look at the other painting of Roger van der Weyden, which for me is an absolutely beautiful painting, then the way in which the head is actually encased within that kind of starched headdress and the black of the dress, it's just beautifully composed. I mean, it finds a kind of total composure. The Lucas Cranach is interesting. Many of those early paintings were, strictly speaking, portraits. This particular Lucas Cranach is called Generalized Portrait of a Woman. It's a combination of many things: mythology, biblical themes, perhaps some direct observation. But as such, it isn't a portrait of anyone. It's an amalgam, perhaps an ideal of what womanhood should be. And many paintings of that period actually had that quality, or if you like, a series of abstractions, rather than actually being a portrait pure and simple. The other painting, which is the Wilhelm Hammershøi, I just love that painting, so I put it up. It's very, very simple, and it is, I presume, a portrait of a woman, a specific woman. But just actually the structure, it's a tiny little painting, it's only this big, but it has just this wonderful directness and simplicity to it. Bernard Barrison, he was an early English art critic who wrote extremely well about art. He wrote a book on Piero della Francesca. And in the book, he sort of gets sidetracked into the nature of portraiture, but in a good way. And he starts talking about what makes a good portrait. And for him, what makes a good portrait is that actually the subject is stilled. That actually the kind of the immediacy of the person is actually slowed down and stilled, and is actually brought to some sort of quintessential essence. And the Hammershøi does that for me, and it's maybe it's a quality I'm trying to get at in the paintings. You know. I've painted so far 14 of these pieces. I'm still working on them. It'll probably they've taken me a couple of years so far. It'll probably take me another year before I finish the group. I'm trying to think back to why suddenly this relationship came up between, in those paintings, in the new paintings, this relationship between the more block sides and the more transparent center. And the only way I can find my way back to it within my own work, and understand it in my own work, is actually going back to some very early pieces. These are called the diptychs. They're very, very big. And one half is made up of an old painting which has been overpainted. And if you like, that's the darker side, in which I'm actually trying to obscure the painting. I'm trying to lose the painting. And the other half is, if you like, newly painted on a new piece of canvas. So each work had this kind of relationship between part of the painting being about losing the image, and a part of the painting being about finding the image, and a kind of dialectic between these two. And I think possibly in the way I've structured the new pieces, I'm somehow going back to this kind of theme. Like the center part of the painting is about revealing as the face reveals, and the side panels are about the way clothing, etc., on one hand reveals something, but on another level also obscures. I did a whole series of, or I have done a whole series of sort of overpainted extended postcards relating to the piece, which were just, well, that's what one does, yeah? And equally I've done a whole series of gouaches that relate to the paintings. I work a lot with gouache. I like its intensity, its colour, and its capacity to also either be very opaque or to be very transparent. And in these I work quite a lot with the torn edges of the paper. Actually has been a kind of part of the structure of the pieces. I made an exhibition, well, I have an exhibition at the moment of 6 of these paintings, plus some related gouaches. And for the show we made a poster, and I was trying to figure out, what do I do? Do I show an image of the painting? The gallery always does 2-meter high vertical posters. It's a tradition they have. They do them for every single show. And so I thought, no, I won't do that. I'll actually just put together a list of names. It's a list of names of women who were actually in historical paintings, of women whose work I admire, be they poets, writers, painters, or what have you. And then the third component is the women I've either worked with professionally or have some kind of work contacts with during my life as an artist. So in that sense, it's a broad list. And I suppose the paintings are, well, they're paintings. I don't know if I can say too much about what they're about. Maybe it's to do with the fact that I grew up in a house without a father, with two sisters and a mother, and that my childhood was spent sewing, darning, knitting, ironing, doing all of the things, cooking, all of the things that women do, and having a good time. And in a sense, my terms of reference as a boy wasn't a man, but was actually women. And maybe I'm just trying to say, something about that. I don't know. I don't really want to delve into the psychology of it all. But anyway, that's the group, and I think that's the studio, that's me working, and yeah, and that's some of the pieces on the go. So if it's okay, I'll finish there.
We can have some questions.
Yeah.
Okay. Any questions?
How do you work in relationship to you making all these very wide paintings? How do you work with the problem of having something very wide, and how to make that whole, so as not to make the composition look as three things that could be separated? How do you put it together as a whole?
Well, I mean, if you're looking at these pieces, I mean, you could say they are, they are three separate entities. They are three separate sections that are brought together. I suppose in these particular pieces, I'm looking to kind of find some edge whereby it holds together, but actually there is separation at the same time.
Yeah, because for me they feel like they're melting into one another, like the three.
Well, of course, one's trying to code it together as one piece of work. So it's a sort of tricky edge.
Have you ever tried to? What do you find the difference between having three separate canvases and maybe the freedom of being able to change them around, or instead of why don't you work with just one big white canvas?
Well, I have done that I mean, many of my works from the pictures you see are very wide canvases, so I've worked a lot with wide canvases. I guess it comes down to what it is you're actually trying to do with the work at any given time. I mean, the first consideration I have when I start working, before I even start working, is should these be vertical paintings? Should the format be vertical? Should the format be horizontal? Should I work in one canvas on a piece, or should I work on two canvases on a piece, or should it be a three-part piece? So all of these considerations are actually the first things I think about before I actually start painting. And it changes from, I mean, if you look through the images, then you find that in fact my work oscillates between the two, that in certain groups I'm vertical. For instance, in these pieces, they're all verticals. It's 12 verticals, and then the group that followed on from that were actually all horizontals. And so, but I just see this as being a kind of natural compacting down, tightening up, and then I'm loosening up again. So it's a sort of self-evolving process that sometimes things tighten up and sometimes they open up again. And I just go with the flow to some extent.
Thank you.
Thank you for the talk. So you mentioned that there were three different types of space in painting. So there's a perspectival, and then the surface space, and then the space between the painting and the view in front of the painting. And I think you mentioned, was it Russian icon painting?
Yeah.
And also that can be seen in Mark Rothko's painting. Could you elaborate more on that space, and maybe is it does it change depending on how far you're standing from the painting and depending on who the viewer is and the height and or I don't know. So.
Yeah. Well, I don't think I can. I don't think I can establish how the viewer comes to the painting. I mean, how someone looks at a piece of work and how they interpret it and how they get to it is totally up to them. But I think, I mean, for instance, if you go to a museum, have you noticed what your optimum viewing point is? I mean, are you someone who stands close to a painting? Are you someone who stands back from a painting? Where do you place yourself? And, you know, for instance, the distance my chair in my studio has been from the painting has been in the same place for, I don't know, ever since I've started working. So it's as if I know inherently there's a certain distance between myself and the painting that is my space, if you like, my distance. And that if I go too far away from that, then actually I'm looking at the painting rather than actually being empathetic with the painting as one body to another. Equally, if I go too close to the painting, I'm actually looking at the detail, or I'm getting into the surface and stuff like that. So for me, there is a certain distance at which we're from the painting, whereby actually the empathy between myself and the painting is at its maximum. And in painting, I'm actually trying to paint that distance, paint that gap. It's very hard to explain because it's not concrete, but it's a real space that has to be navigated. I mean, when you paint a painting, you don't just put paint on a surface which either sits on the surface or put illusionistic marks on, which give you an illusion of depth. You also navigate the space between yourself as the painter and the painting. And it's that area that intrigues me. So it's like a kind of hidden thread, as anyone can describe it, that I'm actually trying to hold on to. And I'm actually trying to touch. I don't have to pin it down more succinctly than that. It's a felt thing. It's very much about sensation and feeling. I mean, you must have noticed that when you go in a museum and you look at paintings, some of them are pushing you away. They're sort of saying, get back, get back. And then there's other paintings that are sort of saying, you know, come closer, come closer. And that for me is part of that actually that negotiated space between the painting and you as a viewer is also a space that somehow was negotiated by the artist. Does it make any kind of sense?
Yeah. For me, it's ongoing investigation.
Sorry, I can't.
It's an ongoing investigation. It really depends on the. I mean, it's hard to explain in words.
Well, yeah, for me, it's ongoing. It's like trying to grab something. You know, it's like if someone said to you, grab the air in front of you. Well, you close your fist and there's nothing there. But of course, there was something there. There's air there. There's water particles. There's all sorts of stuff, germs and all sorts of things floating around. You know, if I keep my hand like that, do I have a nice little goblet of germs and air and water particles here? What do I have? Well, if I do that, they're all gone. It's all sort of slightly intangible, but it's the intangibility that actually makes it interesting. I see no point in painting what's self-evident in the world. I see no point in painting a table or a chair or anything that's already self-evident in the world. If they're already there, why the hell paint it? What interests me is actually trying to get at something that can't be touched other than through painting. And this in itself raises an interesting question. You know, given the propensity to make images, photographs, what have you, you might ask yourself the question, why bother painting? You know, if you want a picture of a chair, photograph it. You know, why paint it? It's the question for me of, and it's the key question, I guess, of what actually can you bring to painting that actually none of the other art forms can actually get their hands on. None of them can quite touch it in the same way. And this, for me, in a sense, is the key question of how do you actually get to something in painting that nothing else can touch. And this area of space, of a certain spatial relationship, and the implications of it, for me this is one of those areas that can be got at or touched, that the other art forms often find quite difficult to get at. For instance, if you think of photography, irrespective of what you do with the photograph afterwards, is actually conventional perspectival space. It's just one kind of space. Whilst painting doesn't have to be there, it can actually find itself in another, it can find space, and it can find its relationship to you in a totally different way.
I think we've got time for one more question. Yes, oh, two more. Two more. Would you like to? You got a question?
You mentioned about your interest in light and how kind of you got, is it right to say that you got a concern that kind of the world is, you know, with the photography, the light is being taken from the world every time we take photos, and I can see like the paintings have got lots of transparency and light in them. Can you say that this is one of your main concerns, kind of to bring that light that's been taken back?
Certainly, light is one of my, light is one of the things I try to work with most, actually, to try and, to try and get that some notion of light in an image, to actually keep the image. I mean, even if you're working on a black painting, it doesn't have to be heavy and dark. You can actually still bring a kind of light into it. And certainly it's one of the areas I work with most consciously, is to actually try and hold on to a notion of light. But it's this special kind of light that actually looks like it's emanating from inside the painting, as opposed to actually being depicted in the painting. So I would like the painting to function like a beam, in a sense, that it's actually letting light out rather than actually taking the light in.
Is that true for the dark paintings?
Sorry?
Is that true also with the dark paintings? Because you've got lots of black paintings.
Yeah, I mean, the bigger a painting gets, the more diffuse it gets. So it's at a certain point, the size of a painting loses a kind of intensity. So maybe it becomes more diffuse. I don't know.
Can I ask? I'm kind of curious. When do you
Sorry, can you speak up?
When do you make the layers on the paintings?
Yeah.
Like choose the colors, or when you try to choose like visual metaphors or devices on the paintings, which one do you prefer to consider more, like between the general emotion of translation to the public, I mean really kind translation to the public, or your
Sorry, start again. You're losing the
from the beginning? Okay. What do you prefer more when you paint on your paintings? Like, when do you choose your own visual devices or any other layers on paintings? Which one do you prefer more to consider between general and kind translation to the public, or your own metaphor to express the colors or visual devices?
I'm not sure again. Are you asking me where the public fits in?
Sometimes it could be like you can consider more general information on the paintings, which can approach the public more easier? Like, I'm kind of curious, you consider those kind of way, or are they just your own interpretation?
I don't think painting is about information, and I don't think a painting should tell you everything. A good painting holds you off. If you can read it all the way through, you can figure out exactly what's going on, and actually the painting is, it's not going anywhere. We come back to the same paintings because actually we can't figure out what they're about and what they're doing to us. So for me, a good painting is both generous in that it lets you in, but at a certain point blocks you off, and it actually stops you going any further. And the painting has to somehow have lots of these options, so that rather than you always having to go in the same way and always having to come out the same way, you're able to go into the painting in different ways, and it can block you off in different ways. So for me, a painting is about inviting you in, only to close the door. And for me, good paintings do that. I don't think paintings offer answers. They're not about giving you a kind of prescribed answer to something. They're actually about asking questions. And of course, the question in the end comes from the artist. But I don't think that question has to be declared. I think it just has to be stated in whatever form it takes. So I don't really think about the public at all. I don't know if they understand my work, I don't know, there's nothing I can do about that. All I can do is make what I make and let it go out into the world. And if someone gets it, great. If they don't get it, that's also good. That's fine. I try to paint slow paintings, so I'm actually trying to slow people down in terms of looking. Everything now in the world is moving so fast, it's going so incredibly fast with the new media and everything. And it seems to me one of the things paintings can still do is actually slow you down in the world. They can actually give you a moment of pause and make you stand still. And I think that's a value, that's still of significance, and it's actually one of the things that paintings can actually still do.
Thank you very much, Ian.